This is episode 376 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Martha Carlin. I'm a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I'm the author, among other things, of a book called Medieval Southwark. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Bait the hook well, this fish will bite. So says Benedick in Much Ado About Nothing. And he's not alone. Shakespeare drops over 70 references to fish and fishing across his plays, from slippery metaphors to full-on fishing scenes, including actual fisherman characters in Pericles. But behind those lines are a very real part of daily life in Elizabethan England. In a world where Protestant reform gave rise to fish days on the calendar and entire industries formed around what came out of the water, one has to wonder, where did all this fish actually come from? Who was catching it? What tools did they use? And could Shakespeare himself have cast a line into the Thames for a bit of dinner? Today, we're casting our net into the past to find out. Joining us is historian Mark Ferguson, here to help us explore the methods, markets, and meaning behind commercial and sport fishing in Shakespeare's England. Let's dive in. Our guest today is Mark Ferguson, a folklorist and curator specializing in the salt fisheries of Newfoundland and Labrador. He currently serves as collections program supervisor at The Rooms, a major cultural and heritage center in St. John's that brings together the province's art, museum, and archival collections. While his expertise centers on North Atlantic fisheries, Mark has explored the early English and Newfoundland fishing industries in relation to the rise of the cod trade. And today, he's here to help us untangle the lines of Elizabethan fishing. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to let you know that there's exclusive history extras available for patrons. When you join us on Patreon, you can access images of museum artifacts featuring Elizabethan fishing gear, along with period paintings and illustrations of fishermen, fisherwomen in Shakespeare's lifetime. And if you're a patron at the Experienced Shakespeare level, you can download our hands-on activity kit that shows you how to try out a fascinating 16th century fishing method involving a candle in a jar. Find out all the details and access these extras when you sign up as a patron inside the show notes this week at cassidycash.com/EP376. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Mark. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
So what sorts of fishing were being engaged in England during the Elizabethan period and on into the early 1600s? Were there different types going on at this time?
Yeah, you could say there were. I mean, again, it's good to differentiate between commercial fishing and sports or recreational fishing. Both were occurring, and again, it's quite interesting. There's a little nice chunk of literature on angling versus fishing. And angling would be with a pole, fishing pole, and a lure and a bait and a hook, those kinds of things. Whereas commercial fishing takes all kinds of forms and can involve hook and line and bait and stuff, but it also involves nets and larger vessels and ships and going out to sea, etc. So, there's that basic distinction, which still holds to this day, obviously, and goes back into, classical times, Egyptian, etc. There are images of fishing poles and people fishing with nets thousands of years ago, kind of thing.
Well, tell us about these fishing poles. Were there fishing poles similar to what we have today available in Elizabethan England?
Yeah, I would say, yes, indeed there were. And I came across a lovely, there's a number of sort of early 17th century treatises on angling. And one of them is called The Secrets of Angling by a guy named John de Denys, 1613. He wrote it. It's written as a poem on how to fish. And he's talking a lot about the fishing pole. And in fact, it contains, according to, the sources I was looking at, one of the earliest references to a reel attached to the pole. And he's got a little verse about, you can make this reel up that attaches to the pole and wind in your line. It's a lovely little poem. I'll send you the link afterwards. I can even read the verse if you want.
I was really hoping you were going to say that. I would love to hear some of the verses.
Okay, well, here's the one about the reel anyway. Yet there remains of fishing tools to tell, some other sorts that you must have as well. A little board, the lightest you can find, but not so thin that it will break or bend. Made smooth and plain your lines thereon to wind, with battlements at every other end, like to the bulwark of some ancient town, as well-walled Silchester now raised down. So the bulwarks are, I think, are on the sides of the reel, so the line won't slip off the reel while you're reeling it in. And I guess they were starting to figure out how to attach such a device to a fishing pole so that you could let line in and out as you were fishing. So that's kind of an interesting fact. And that's 1613. I don't know if it was invented in England per se, but again, clearly angling was a pastime that people indulged in. I presume, again, more generally would be upper class kind of folk, for sure. But no doubt others did too. Yeah. So that's the pole thing. Yeah.
In Pericles Act 2, the stage directions tell the first and second fishermen to be seen drawing up a net. So Shakespeare has this in his script of here's what I want them to be seen doing. And I was wondering, Mark, if you could tell us whether drawing up a net was recognizable, so popular enough that they could be doing this on stage and people would know what was going on, and what other kinds of fishing methods were available if you've got the pole fishing and then you've also got nets. What's the spectrum here of ways to fish?
Right. Yeah. And again, I think net fishing would generally be a larger scale commercial activity. First of all, you got to get all the materials together to make the net, and the weights to sink it, and the floats to float the top of it, and etc. So you can kind of put it in the water. But again, it would have been very common along the coasts of England and Wales and Scotland, I'm sure, to fish with nets. So yeah, it would be very recognizable to almost everyone. Certainly in London of the era, there was fishing going on all around that area, commercial activities. I would say, and the nets, they were generally at the time more for pelagic fish that came to the surface or lived on the surface of the ocean. Nets for sort of sinking down to the bottom of the sea to any kind of depth were a little bit probably not as common or regular. The materials have to be stronger and a lot more of an investment to kind of make them work, and risky as a result, because they're down at the bottom and there's tides and currents and that was an issue in Newfoundland. So generally you find, I think the most references I found for using nets were more for the smaller pelagics like herring, maybe hake, which is a sort of a small type of whitefish, like cod. And they were often fished, at night in Newfoundland, for example, the bait fishery. They would catch bait to catch cod, but the herring fishery too, I'm sure, use nets most of the time. And they're a surface fish. But a lot of fish rise up at night from like bottom fish, like hake will rise up and come to the surface. So boats go out in the night with the nets, and they kind of they'll drag them between two boats and just kind of move into shoals of fish, or they'll set them in a certain spot with weights and come back in the morning. Fishing at night was easier because the fish didn't see the nets in the boats. The twine was kind of, fishing twine was made, usually of hemp, spun hemp into the lines and knitted, which goes back thousands of years, as I was saying. But it was barked. That was called the term here in Newfoundland, but I'm sure elsewhere it was barked or put
into.
Could you
spell that for us, please? Barked?
Barked. That's kind of a Newfoundland term. It's like a soaking in a mixture of tars and substances made from tree bark is where it comes from here. So and resins from trees like spruce or fir resins, and you would soak the twine in these big cauldrons called barking kettles here, and this was, I'm sure, done back then in that time to preserve them, but also to darken them up so they would be less visible to the fish and more likely to catch them. And I don't really know about the sizes of nets. They probably weren't too long. I'd say 10 or 15 fathoms or 90 feet would be the maximum length I would suggest. But again, I don't know much about that for sure. So that kind of net would have been being made in specialty places that grew hemp, and which is related to flax, and flax was used to make linen, which they used for sailcloth, but hemp was related, and they would use the hemp to kind of make the twines, and the ropes of the era. Hemp ropes were very, very common. But places like in the West Country of England, around Bridport, there was a net and rope making kind of works, and a long-standing tradition going back to the 1200s of it being a place that made sailcloth and nets and lines for ships to serve the Navy, in fact. And Bridport continues being a rope and net making and sailcloth making place right into the 1800s, probably into the early 1900s. And it still may be making them. They had rope walks and all kinds of things. And again, it's a time-honored kind of trade that would have developed with, guilds and all that kind of thing at the time. So that's about all I can say about nets. Other kinds of fishing, hook and line is probably the oldest and the most basic kind of fishing technique that people would use. A metal hook on a hemp line for the most part, and you bait that hook with some kind of bait that you've cat caught or whatever hunted. And of course, when on a fishing pole, it's attached to the pole and the line. Out at sea, they called them. You would have a hand line reel. It would just be a very simple piece of wood with a kind of a frame that you would wrap the line around, and it wouldn't be like a pole. You just lower it in, and the bait would go down to the bottom. This would be for the ground fish, the bottom feeding fish like cod and like ling and hake to some extent. They're bigger whitefish, and they're harder to catch in nets because they're so much bigger and stronger and heavier, and the gear just wasn't up to catching them as well. I would suggest. And so hook and line was used in the commercial fishery a lot. There's another concept called the long line, which is basically, as it implies, the long line, and off that long line are things called, they call them here seds, or snoods is the English term, snoods. But in Newfoundland, they call them seds or suds. And they're just little lines with hooks on each little line that's tied onto the long line. And you can kind of drop them. They call them trawls here. You drop this long line of rope with little hooks going down, baited hooks going down to the bottom, and you just hold them off the surface of the bottom, and they catch the fish. And you once every day or so, you go out and you haul the whole line and take the fish off one by one. Then you rebait and set it again. So that's a time-honored technique that was used in where the English fished, I'm sure. At the time, before the onset of the Newfoundland fishery for the English, which was the late 1500s, early 1600s, they were fishing a lot off of Iceland and the Faroes, and fishing for cod and ling and hake. And it was a commercial venture, though I would suggest, that we'll talk about a bit later, it was for local markets, more so like bringing it back to London, rather than exporting anywhere else, because other nations in the north of Europe had their own fisheries. The Dutch at the time pretty much dominated the herring fishery. The various other nations tried to compete, but the Dutch really had the herring fishery sewn up in the North Sea. And there was some cod fishing and ling fishing and probably herring and et cetera, mac, other bait fish and eating fish off the Norwegian coast going north, kind of running north, and in the Baltic to some extent. But again, a lot of those were local as well, serving local markets. So English fishers fishing for English towns and villages and cities, kind of thing, versus for export. Though a certain amount did occur at that time. So I think those were the main techniques catching fish at the time, I would suggest. There might have been the odd, there's a concept of a seine, which is a net which you wrap around a school of fish. Again, it's usually smaller bait fish. You get two ends, two boats, and they circle the shoal of fish, and the net drops down underneath. And you haul it up like that. But that's the basic same concept as just a standard net, but with a certain kind of use of techniques and stuff.
Now, you mentioned fishing hooks, and I think we understand visually in our mind what that would have looked like, but I'm wondering how they were made. Would the individual fishermen have, been on their boats crafting these to use on their lines, or were there guilds or shops where they would be sourcing their hooks and they would go buy like a box of fish hooks, for example?
I would suggest the latter. Again, I think most of the hooks of the era were iron, wrought iron kind of hooks. And those would be made, yes, in specialty kind of blacksmith shops and foundries. There was, again, and for the commercial fishery where you had a concept like a long line with many hooks needed, and hooks broke all the time when you caught large fish and snapped off in their mouths.
So you're not on your ship having to craft these. You would,
I mean,
that would not.
Again, most of the fishing stations in Newfoundland at the time would have had a blacksmith with them, and he would have had materials for a sort of a portable forge or mini forge to do rough and ready work, repair work. But that would, I would suggest, be for larger kinds of activities, like things, major metal pieces that broke versus making fish hooks. I would suggest they would have brought their fish hooks with them, and they would have purchased them from a specialized company or guild or a foundry per se that was making those kinds of products on a sort of a more mass scale, I guess. Not factory per se, but getting there.
Yeah. Speaking of supplies that you're going to take with you here, Falstaff gives us a look into the world of fishermen because he mentions specifically fishermen's boots in Merry Wives of Windsor. This comes up in Act 4. And were there special boots designed for fishermen in this time period? And what other accessories might have been used by a private fisherman? Not necessarily these, huge commercial ventures, but I like to think of the image of a fisherman having, the hat and the basket for carrying caught fish, for example. Is that an accurate for Shakespeare? Or would he have been something else?
I think that would have been actually accurate for sure. And again, a dedicated riverine fisher or even a little kind of like inshore coastal water hook and line guy with a fishing pole might own a pair of fishing boots. And yes, there were specialty made. I mean, I don't think, well, they wouldn't be called fishermen's boots because they were often quite high, not quite the hip waders that people now can get, but up to the thighs for sure. We have a beautiful, well, I guess this is the remnant of one Basque fishing boot that was lost in a shipwreck here off the coast of Newfoundland in mid-1600s, I believe. And it's a big, long piece of combinations of pieces of leather which survived. And yeah, so I think when, again, guys, especially fishermen are going out to sea, would have had a lot of specialized gear, clothing and boots and hats and wool, kind of often a lot of it waterproof in various ways. The wool itself is kind of waterproof to a certain extent, but the boots they would get. I mean, the reference is quite lovely. I was reading that reference and thinking a lot about, the oil. Falstaff's making a joke about himself, or ruefully saying, if they hear about what just happened to me, the treatment I received at the wives' hands, I would be rendered out. They would render me out and get all my fat, and that would be enough oil from all the fat that I have in my body to oil a pair of boots. And when he's saying oil a pair of boots, he's meaning, I presume, waterproofing them. There's another lovely paragraph I came across. It's from a thing. It's called The Baker's Delight, or The Art of Angling, 1659. A guy named Thomas Barker. Barker's Delight. Sorry, not Baker's. Thomas Barker. So he writes this lovely paragraph about waterproofing fishing gear. I have a willing mind, with God's help, to preserve all those that love this recreation, to go dry in their boots and shoes, to preserve their healths, which one receipt is worth much more than this book will cost. First, they must take a pint of linseed oil with half a pound of mutton suet, 6 or 8 ounces of beeswax, and a half a penny worth of rosin. Boil all this in a pipkin together, so let it cool until it be milk warm. Then take a little hairbrush and lay it on your new boots. But it's best that the stuff be laid on before the bootmaker makes the boots. Then brush them once over after they come from him. As for old boots, you must lay it on when your boots be dry. So it's basically, I know it's like there's so many modern products on the market to treat leather to keep them waterproof, like dubbin, all those kinds of things. Probably the same kinds of ingredients. And linseed oil was a really important product. Again, and it was grown in the West Country on purpose to oil things and to soak, again, gear and sails to keep them preserved as long as they could when they went out to sea, so they wouldn't absorb water and get soggy and rot and stuff. So anyway, that's fishermen's boots. There was a lot of ready-mades kind of produced in kind of factories, and I assume this happened in England, to fit out fishing crews that were going on transatlantic or distant water fishing trips. We have a lovely the remnants. Well, it's actually almost a full woolen cap that came from a Basque whaling site in this case, but I'm sure it would apply to fishing sites in Red Bay, Labrador. It's a Basque woolen cap for guys going out in boat. Beautiful hat, and again, it's very clear that it's stenciled in such a way that it's very clear that it was manufactured by some kind of a shop rather than handmade by a single person. Well, probably was handmade by a single person, but in a very much of a trades sort of setting. And they would have been making a bunch of them and providing them to crews and that sort of a thing. So there's hats, there's boots, there's a lot of woolen goods, sweaters and coats and all kinds of things they would need for working over here. Newfoundland is remarkably cold stretch of coast because of the Labrador Current comes down from the Arctic and wraps the island completely in freezing cold ocean water most of the year, or all the year for the most part. And the combination of that kind of water splashing around and wind and waves and fog make it a very tough place to be.
If you're going to survive on the ocean, you're going to have to stay warm.
Yeah, exactly right. And the same would go for Iceland and the Faroes and those northern fishing spots that a lot of these distant water fleets kind of went to fish in. Early to mid 1600s, a lot of people started to settle in Newfoundland. Not a lot, but a good number to fish year round, and they would stay in the winter. Ships would come out with provisions and goods, and there's a lovely list of stuff that an Irish ship brought over in 1681, which included all sorts of, I'll read the quote again, all sorts of friezes, which is a rough woolen material, friezes, linen cloth, candles, cloth, hats, shoes, stockings, beef, pork, bread, butter, cheese, all those kinds of things. So combination of food provisions, but also clothing and related gear so people can continue to stay warm. And again, eventually people started raising their own sheep and that kind of thing too. But at that time, a lot of, again, I would assume ready-made goods were coming here. And again, I would say we're fitting out other crews going elsewhere around the North Atlantic.
So in addition to there being a commercial fishing industry, there was a companion industry of supplying those fishermen so that they could do their job.
Exactly correct. And again, a certain amount of that would have been brought over when a fishing ship left the coast of England from wherever it was going to wherever it was going. They would have brought a lot of those fishing tools and materials with them that they would have picked up in local places where they were the centers they were fishing from or nearby. But also a lot of these things were brought over by what were called sack ships. And they would come over with supplies of different kinds of, just those kinds of goods I just mentioned. Probably not so much food, but they bring over clothing and tools and crockery and wine and port and other luxury kind of items. Tobacco was often, Newfoundland became a really, I mean, again, I'm sort of getting off topic here on Newfoundland, but it became a really interesting trading point in a triangle trade that, again, this companion industry kind of supplied, but benefited hugely from, because they would come and bring these things, trade them, take loads of fish back with them to Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Canary Islands. Eventually, the Caribbean got involved as well. And Newfoundland fish would go to those places. And then the English, if there was English, brought the fish. And these specialty sack ships would carry the fish, not the actual ships that went with the fishing crews. They would just go back to England for the most part. These sack ships would come and bring all the fish to those Mediterranean ports for the most part, and take back either actual bullion or trade goods that were much wanted and demanded in England. Wines from France and Spain, Italy, olive oil, that kind of thing. So it was a great triangular trade, one of the very first transatlantic triangular trades.
In the play King Lear, Act 1, the Earl of Kent is professing his virtues, and after listing that he is an honest fellow who seeks out wisdom and only fights when he has to, he ends his proclamation by saying, "And to eat no fish." There's definitely some kind of character reference there in being someone that does not eat fish. What does the history of fish and fisheries in England tell us about why the Earl of Kent would have wanted to be known as someone who doesn't eat fish?
Yeah, that's a really interesting line, and again, I basically based on a bunch of reading around it and stuff. It's clearly a reference to the Protestant kind of Reformation and resisting Catholic practices and turning their backs on Catholic practices and banning them to some extent, or trying to at different points. And again, it was a constant seesaw back and forth between, two traditions and the conflicts between them. But so I think he's speaking to Lear, and he's kind of professing his loyalty to. And now it's all kind of anachronistic because King Lear is set back in a pre-Christian kind of context. But nevertheless, it's obviously a nod to the current situation that Shakespeare is writing in, where there's a lot of tension around Catholic-Protestant relations. Now, the very funny, or not funny thing, but the very interesting thing is that though, again, there was the whole concept of fasting days that the Catholic Church had imposed, which had been going on for a few hundred years at that point, if not longer. Fasting, of course, is a concept that lots of spiritual practices use different times. But to not eat meat and that kind of thing goes back. But the Protestant kind of monarchs that followed Henry VIII, and maybe even Henry himself, I can't quite remember, but Edward VI, the son, and then Mary was Catholic, but then Elizabeth was Protestant, and some of the Stuarts, even though they were Protestants and kind of professed, to be against the kind of Catholic practices, they still continued with fish days or fast days, in a sense, and it's said over and over again in all kinds of sources to encourage the fishing industry, which was a huge part of the economy. Not huge, but it was a big part of the economy. So, and I think at one point I read somewhere that in Elizabeth's time, technically speaking, if you actually did all the fast days that were kind of imposed by the proclamations they were making, it was over half the year were fish days kind of thing, or not meat days anyway. Now, again, I think there was lots of slippage and, rule breaking and there were ways to get, you could get dispensation not to have meat on a fish day, but generally they were trying to. Edward VI and Elizabeth I were trying to encourage the fisheries. And again, I think one of the questions we talked about was that, it was a number of things. It encouraged the fisheries, which was a commercial, a trade that brought lots of money into the coffers of business people and the government and the monarchy. But also it encouraged training at sea and naval training. And so you get a tremendous, that argument goes on into the 1900s, that Newfoundland, for example, was a nursery for seamen to train. And if they came over here, they became excellent boat handlers and sailors and were very at home on the sea.
If you can make it in Newfoundland, you'll be okay anywhere.
Pretty much. And again, there's a famous line that Churchill was supposed to have said, again, flipping forward 300 years to, the Newfoundland was produced the best small boatmen in the world. They were incredibly adept, and again, I can attest to it, having been out in boat with many fishermen over the years, who are just incredible. The way they handle boats in very rough conditions on the Northwest Atlantic, which is very rough.
They're going to be the best of the best coming from there.
In terms of that work, yeah, for sure. And they can handle the cold and the wet and all that stuff too. Yeah.
Now, I know you've explained why it was important to England's economy that people eat the fish, but I was wondering if there was any specific kind of fish that was seen as the most important. You've mentioned several different kinds that would have been caught in these different ways, but in England, were they eating a particular kind of fish on fish days, or just any kind of fish will do?
I think, again, whatever was most prolific and most available through commercial markets, I'm sure, and that could be lots of different kinds. But I mean, again, I think by the 1500s, 1600s, your basic urban population would be being fed on in and around London, for example, would be kind of eating a lot of herring, which the Dutch fishery had, as I mentioned earlier, had kind of completely monopolized, and they were the best. And that would be served in various forms, salted, I'm sure fresh too, they'd come in, and local fishing crews would be going out in nearby waters and bringing in fresh fish to sell it with the fish mongers, of which there were hundreds, if not thousands, around, certainly over the decades. But so herring was huge. Cod and ling, which is kind of like another kind of branch of the family of cod, and hake were all good fish because they dried well. Herring and salmon are oily; they're harder to preserve. They don't preserve as well in salting and drying because of the oil kind of can easily go off if you're not careful and you don't do it right. But those would be caught too. There would be salmon caught commercially and sold. Again, probably a little bit more expensive. But herring would be kind of more middle class, working class fish. That's my understanding. Cod and hake too would have been pretty much available to lots of different people. By the early 1600s, cod in England per se was well known, or various variations thereof, and the product they made from them. There's a concept of haberdine, Habardine, which is kind of a salted fish. It's sometimes cod, sometimes it's hake, sometimes it's ling, but it's produced in a certain way that makes it's a salted white fish that you then have to get and water it for a period of time, like soak it in successive pots of water before you cook it to get all the salt out, because it's super, super salty. And the English and the French and the Dutch, same with herring, they would be salting it in the holes of the vessels they were catching the fish in. They'd bring them to market. They would sell them salted, and the consumer would take them home and prepare them, get the salt out, and then to eat them. And so that was those were the main fisheries. There were all kinds of species, though, that came up as well that they would take advantage of. Various kinds of flatfish, plaice, and I never saw a reference to turbot. One of the books I was going to recommend, which I just came across when I was sort of getting prepared for this, it's a lovely book. It's late 19th century. It's kind of The Animals of Shakespeare's Time by a woman, Emma Phipson, 1883. The Animal Lore of Shakespeare, and it's online. You can get it. And there's a huge chapter on all the fish that people were eating and all that, and different things about the fish and their habits, where they were caught, all that kind of thing. And people were eating anything. They could get everything from shellfish, mussels, and cockles, and all that kind of stuff, and shrimp to some extent, I presume, to the whitefish and the salmon and shark and tuna. All kinds of fish were being sought after and caught. But again, I think the large commercial marketable fish were herring and cod and ling and hake. Those are the names you come across most often, being caught in big amounts and shipped around, kind of thing.
I know that Newfoundland was a popular fishery destination for other parts of Europe, Spain in particular, who would travel there to catch cod. However, one account I read said that in 1573, there were only 4 English vessels in that area, which contrasted pretty starkly with the amount of other vessels that were in the area. Does that mean that England was not importing fish at the same levels as the rest of the continent, or that they just didn't have a taste for cod in particular?
Oh, no, I don't think it has to do with the taste for cod. They were eating cod and hake, but they were getting it from Iceland and off the coast of Norway, the Faroes, that kind of thing. It's just that they hadn't entered into the Newfoundland fisheries. And that's partly a geographical phenomenon, partly a historical trait. Cabot in 1497 discovered Newfoundland, quotes, and brought back word of huge amounts of cod, which spread around quickly. And there's some thought that others had already been there. Some Bristol fishing expeditions had gone over there and found it, but it was never recorded until Cabot. But right from post 1497, some of the earliest Basque and French crews and Spanish crews started arriving in Newfoundland waters, and then Portuguese not long after, because they were big distant water people and ability to travel the Atlantic. They began fishing right away there and established spots and fishing grounds and spots on the land they could fish from. The English, because the West Country hadn't even thought about getting involved in this trade at this point, didn't get involved till much later in the century, towards the end of the 1500s. They were aware that there was a fish over there. I think, and then the northeastern coast of England, Hull and Grimsby, all those places, they were focused on Iceland and Norway. Much easier to get there and get back with fish loads than to Newfoundland for them. Whereas the West Country on the southwest coast and the channel there was a much better place to shoot across and get involved. So the English more and more became aware that there was this amazing cod fishery over there. And in the late 1500s, between the Armada kind of collapsing and the Spanish Navy getting destroyed, and the British, a combination of piracy and privateering, entered into the fish market around that time, into the Newfoundland fishing market, and very quickly realized how lucrative it was as an operation. And they then took that cod that they were catching there to Spain and Italy and wherever, in Portugal, and basically forced the Basques and the Spanish and the French out, not the French, but the Basques, the Spanish and the Portuguese out of the place they'd been fishing by brute force, more or less, and took over those spots on what was called the English shore at that point, around 16, in late 1500s, early 1600s. So, Drake and Raleigh were both involved. Their West Countrymen were both involved in kind of disrupting the Spanish trade. The English moved in and very quickly started producing this particular product of salt cod that they were basically not going to bring back to England because they had enough of their own fisheries to go on. It was all basically becoming part of this international triangular trade, which was incredibly lucrative. The amount of cod here was remarkable, and the ease of getting it was equally remarkable. It was a bit of a risk to get over here, and it was rough life here when you got here to fish. But once you got that cod and got it salted and got it dried, it was a specific product, too, that really met the southern Mediterranean. The French had a huge cod fishery, but it was mainly for their own domestic market. It was a heavier salted, they called it green fish, whereas Newfoundland cod was English cod and Portuguese and Basque cod before them, was salted lightly for a few days or a week or two, taken out of salt, rinsed, dried in the open air on things called fish flakes, which are basically platforms of wood that they would put the fish on, and they were split open, and the guts were taken out, and that kind of thing, and then they were salted, split open down to the tail, and the heads were removed to get this triangular shaped kind of piece of white fish, which is the classic, salted fish from here, and it was sun dried to a hardness and a dryness that it could keep for years, could last for years. So it was great for the Mediterranean market, which was hot and often damp and just warm. So you could store this stuff, and it could be used year round, and it became a niche market for the English from then on.
I'm wondering if in the play Antony and Cleopatra, in Act 2, there's a reference to the phrase salt fish. The chairman says, "You wagered on your angling when your diver did hang a salt fish on his hook when he with fervency drew up." And in this 16th century commercial fishing industry, what you're talking about here, where they are preserving the fish in salt, is Shakespeare referencing that process with this quote? Would they have called that salt fish?
I think they would have, yeah. And again, I kind of looked at that closely, and Cleopatra's servant Carmine they're joking back and forth about hooking Antony romantically so that she can get him and kind of reel him in. Supposedly, there is a reference in one of the famous Roman texts to Antony and Cleopatra, and at one point, her playing a trick on him by having a diver, literally a guy in the water with a fish, and he hooked onto Antony's hook, and he drew it in thinking he caught a fish and was very proud of himself. The hilarious thing about it, and which is kind of the joke, I think, which makes fun of Antony, he must have been not too bright, but to put a processed saltfish onto a hook that you draw out of the ocean would be completely, absurd.
They're making fun of him. Yeah,
kind of making fun of him. And there was I was reading one woman, a Cambridge professor, talking about how, again, the saltfish was a hard dried kind of product, and again, it would have been sort of this weird thing coming out of the sea, ready to go kind of thing, all cleaned and hard dried. And it was kind of, again, sort of emasculating, almost making a fool of him kind of thing, that this weird hard saltfish came out of the water. And there were drying techniques for whitefish, including cod, in Iceland. They used a technique which didn't involve salt, and they produced another kind of fish called stockfish, which was air dried in the wintertime pretty much. And they just kind of cut the fish in a certain way and just hung it on lines, and it air dried and got really hard and super. And to cook it was, but it's got a particular market in the south of, and so the English were probably partaking in that a little bit. I don't think they were more doing the green saltfish, though, I think, in their own vessels. But they would have been buying stockfish from the Icelanders and the Norwegians and marketing it themselves elsewhere. But again, they weren't exporting that in any way, I don't think. Maybe a little bit, but not a great deal. The cod became the thing for them.
In two plays, The Tempest and in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare references Poor John, and it's sometimes called Poor Jack. Is this a reference to a fish product from Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yes, indeed. And again, it could be, I think that may be the only one that really is, or might potentially have been a Newfoundland reference in it. Again, because a saltfish, when it's dried and ready to be, sold to a person, it's an ugly looking beast. It's kind of beheaded, first of all, and it's very dry and cracked up and gnarled and strange looking. So it's not a pretty thing at all. So the reference in Romeo and Juliet is, guys making fun of the guy's looks. You're not handsome at all. You're as ugly as a poor Jack. I'll send you a picture of a saltfish when you can post that. People can look at a Newfoundland saltfish. So that's that. And then the other one, what's the other reference was in? Was it
in The Tempest? Yeah,
Tempest, right? And
for poor John,
Trinculo climbs under a blanket with Caliban and describes him again as a very ugly, and he's got a foul smell to him, and it's very much of a poor John smell. And saltfish did have a very strong odor to it, especially when it was cooking. When you cook saltfish, it does have a very particular strong odor. A lot of people do not like it being cooked in their house. They don't mind eating it, but they don't want it cooked because it's got a
cook it outside.
Yeah. Well, it's very true. Yeah, some people do. But again, I think if you're used to that was a great story. I mean, this is totally off track, but a great story here. I interviewed an older fisherman years ago, and he was telling me when he was growing up, you had your all the houses that out around the bay, especially and outports of Newfoundland, these fishing communities that descended from the Newfoundland fishery way back in the 1500s. All the washrooms were out houses, and people cooked their fish in their kitchens. And his daughter came home to visit him, and she couldn't stand the smell of saltfish because she wasn't used to it. So she made him cook it outside. And then he made some crack about it. Now the toilets are in the houses and they get the cookouts. The cook outside. But anyway, the point is, the Caliban smelled like a saltfish, and stunk, in other words. Again, I presume at this point some Newfoundland fish had entered the English market. I mean, there were English ships picking up fish in the 1570s, as you noted. There wasn't many there. But they cottoned on to what an amazing trade it was, and they came and bought fish to ship to markets. And no doubt some got to England and were in circulation for sure. People would have had the opportunity to eat them. And again, the Icelandic saltfish and the Norwegian saltfish they were catching themselves would have been on the market too, though it's quite a different kind of fish. But probably looked more or less the same, split open and just a little bit wetter than the dried Newfoundland stuff that has a very gnarled, broken up kind of look to it, Yeah.
Well, I know during this time there was something called a fish revolution. Can you tell us about what this was called and how did that change the diets of people in England?
Right. I would suggest that, interestingly enough, it had really very little to do with diet in England. The fish revolution that you're referring to is really, and I've been alluding to it a lot over the last few minutes, is that shift to this giant cod resource off the Newfoundland coast, Grand Banks, and the New England coast to some extent, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The French, the English kind of dominated it from the early 1600s 1600s on. And it revolutionized, it started a kind of a transatlantic circle of trade, as I've mentioned, or a triangle of trade. The previous to it really kicking off and the English becoming very involved through the Devon and Dorset and West Country, Bristol, Cornwall to some extent, counties getting involved. Previous to that, those northeastern Atlantic fisheries dominated, and the fish coming from them was sold in England and was similar to what was being produced in Newfoundland. But then I think what happened was that codfish that went from Newfoundland to Spain and Italy and France and the Basque country of Portugal, it probably allowed for a lot more products at a cheaper rate to come into England, wine and grapes and oranges and olive oil and all that kind of thing, and probably adjusted diets then. The thing that I was reading about the transformation through the 16 into the 1700s was that the amount of fish that Europeans were eating went up. Now, again, whether this happened in England, I can't vouch for it, but certainly in Spain and Italy and Portugal, the amount per capita per year of fish that people were eating went up in a dramatic amount. And again, cod particularly from Newfoundland, but just because of the tremendous amount of fish that could be caught so easily and so cheaply in the Newfoundland and the Northwest Atlantic waters, it revolutionized, markets and diet and got more protein into the diets of people. And then this trade thing that took off really kind of got, you could argue, and I think various political economists and historians have argued that it was really as important in many ways as the Spanish kind of going to the Caribbean and South America and Central America and Mexico and bringing back all that gold and silver. In fact, this was a much more practical product that people, needed to consume. And the English used it to make money by selling this fish they could catch so easily, so much of. And they would trade it for wine and and for gold and silver and fruits and olive oil and all that kind of thing. And you get this big circle of trade going, which does revolutionize the Europe. And then as you open up North America, it also changes. It allows for the development of the New England states for sure, and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and et cetera, et cetera.
There is obviously so much history to be explored here, from the individual fisherman with his fishing pole, bait and hook, and woolen sweaters and all of that, as well as the fish revolution and the rise of the cod trade in this time period. If we're new to this part of history and we want to explore further, what resources can you recommend we use to learn more?
Right. Well, I would suggest, in terms of that fish revolution question, for sure, but it's also a great introduction to kind of social history of the era, a little bit later than Shakespeare, but not much, is Dr. Peter Pope's Fish into Wine, the Newfoundland plantation in the 17th century. And it covers sort of the 1630s right on up to the end of the 1600s, and looks at this early development of this international trading kind of network and how it worked in specifically on the English shore of Newfoundland in relation to the West Country and in relation to the trade to Spain and Portugal and elsewhere. It's a fantastic book. It's quite dense, but it's a really excellent read. And he's got some fantastic ideas that have actually, I was reading around in preparation for this and looking at a lot of other sources, and he's had a great influence on a lot of other modern fisheries historian thinkers about a combination of social, economic, political, but also ecological, kind of looking at why the Newfoundland fishery was so enormous and prolific. Another book I mentioned earlier, Emma Phipson's The Animal Lore of Shakespeare's Time. It's a very fun book to read, and it's sort of, it just calls all these sources. She says at the beginning, I'm just pulling all these different, late Elizabethan, early, Stuart references to animals in Shakespeare. So it's just an exploration of all the different sources she could find talking about, particularly from an English perspective, about all the animals of Shakespeare that appeared in his plays and works. But she then goes into all these other sources talking about all these animals and how they were perceived, the folklore about them. So it's quite a fascinating read. It's a bit of just a giant compendium, but it's a lot of fun. And the fish section is excellent. I mentioned that John Denny's the Secrets of Angling, which is not a long poem, but it's kind of fun and gives lots of insights into the recreational sports fishing thing. Well, there's a good number of really important archaeological sites here in Newfoundland that have been written about and are online. You can look them up that go back to that period, the early 1600s, the late 1500s, early 1600s, of fishing crews and fishing activities along our coasts, different communities. There was a very well-known a community called Ferryland on the southern shore. It's about an hour from where I am right now, St. John's. That was originally started as a plantation. There were these kind of plantations begun by usually upper middle class or upper class men. Lord Baltimore, who founded Baltimore and Maryland, he first came to Newfoundland. He wanted to start a kind of a free, basically a Catholic, safe Catholic place for Catholics to come from England to escape the persecution there. In 1620 or so, he established it. And he brought his family and his retinue over in the mid-1620s. But he couldn't hack the weather was much too horrible for them. They couldn't hack it. They got scurvy and they didn't know what to do. And they weren't ready to handle it. They thought it would be just like England, climate-wise, but it's much harsher. So they all took off for Baltimore and Maryland, where he then set up. But then he was followed by a guy named David Kirk and Sarah Kirk, his wife, and his sons, and they set up a huge fishing plantation there. And it's now been excavated very fully by teams from here, and it's fantastic treasure trove of artifacts of that period, fantastic ceramics, fishing paraphernalia. Anyway, you look up the Colony of Avalon online. There's lots of great stuff on it and stories about it. I'm going to send you 2 links to more kind of a recent dig in Bay Bulls, as a community just south of St. John's, where they did some digging around the water line where the ocean comes in, and found a lot of mid to late 1600s artifacts, fisheries related stuff. Some great fisheries. Gives a peek into what the fishery was like here and the kinds of material culture that was involved. Lots of great photos. Beautiful reed mat, which you rarely find because they disintegrate, was uncovered from that era, which was probably brought over from England as a mat and to put into a house or a little, they worked in, the crews here were almost completely, in the summertime, the whole coast of Newfoundland would swell with thousands of English crew people coming here to fish, and they would leave in the fall again. And every time they'd arrive, they'd sort of build up cook rooms and places to sleep, as well as fish, all the architecture they needed for the fishing. So there's lots of stuff on that. Anyway, I'll send those links to you. And last but not least, I'll send you a document from 1676 by a guy named John Downing, who was an early planter here in St. John's Harbor, just down the hill from where I'm standing now or sitting now. It's called The Manner of Catching and Making Dry Fish in Newland. And it's basically a treatise, a long, carefully written description of how they made fish here, which would have applied to Iceland. Well, not so much Iceland, but apply to all over here, and this fish we've been talking about for the last sort of hour or so. It's a really close description of that, and it's quite good. And I'll send along some notes along with that. You can post as well.
These sound excellent. Yes, we will place links to all of these in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Mark, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, great. Yeah, well, I last year and a half, I read this. I've really enjoyed reading a fantastic book called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. and it's a David Graeber and David Wengrow, and it's a wide-ranging, fascinating book about new kind of analysis of and new understandings of all kinds of ancient human sites around the world and how civilization kind of emerged out of them, challenging the kind of its main thesis is to challenge the whole idea that there was a kind of the natural order, the Rousseauian order of hunter-gatherer evolves into agricultural, evolves into cities, evolves into kind of city-states run by kings and queens. And it challenges all those kind of ideas by just looking at literally dozens and dozens of really fascinating archaeological sites, for the most part, around the world. And it's a great book. I highly recommend. Very long too, so you can go on for weeks and you can reread all kinds of stuff.
Certainly gives you a lot to think about and ponder, so you aren't bored on your island stay. I think that's a productive choice for sure. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah, well, right now, I think the thing I'm most excited about, and it's a perfect little tie into our discussion. And in fact, I should have mentioned, there's these two paintings by a guy named Gerard van Edema, who was a Dutch painter who immigrated to England in the mid-1600s. And it sounds like he might have come over here he was being patronized by a wealthy English fish merchant. It sounds like he might have come over here one summer in the late 1600s, 1670s, 1680s, and probably just sketched, because they weren't painting on site at that point. He would have made sketches of the place, gone back to England, and made two large paintings of what we presume is Newfoundland, because of his connections where he was. He was probably on the English shore here, and he probably made these paintings based on sketches he did here of Newfoundland. So they're really early North American paintings of this landscape, and they include fisheries, architecture, and fishing flakes where they're drawing fish, and people kind of doing the work of the fishery at the time. So there's these two paintings. One of them is in the hands of a private donor. One is at the Royal Ontario Museum. And we're hoping to bring them down here and put them on display to kind of explore this whole idea of the early cod fishery here. And they're such really, really interesting early examples of fine art paintings of North America to exist even is fantastic. So that's and I'm working on the project to bring them here and to curate them and bring people in to see them at the museum that I work at.
That sounds so exciting. We'll look forward to them being on display. How much fun.
In fact, one of them on the sites that I'm going to give you links to for Bay Bulls, one of those paintings is fully displayed on that website. So you can look at one of the two paintings.
Oh, fantastic. We'll make
sure
sure that gets into the show notes so people can see that.
The wrong one. Yeah, very good.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing this history with us, Mark. It's been fun talking with you and getting to learn more about fishing and fisheries from Shakespeare's lifetime. Thank you for sharing it with us.
You're very welcome.
That's it for today's deep dive into the waters of Elizabethan England. A big thank you to Mark Ferguson for sharing his expert knowledge on the fascinating world of fishing in Shakespeare's time. If you're eager to learn more about the fishing methods we discussed today or want to explore the historical resources Mark mentioned, head to the show notes page. We've gathered everything for you there, including more information on Experience Shakespeare on Patreon, where you can try out that surprising but completely authentic 16th century candle fishing method, all packed into the show notes. That's available today at cassidycash.com/episode 376. Again, that's cassidycash.com/EP376. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.